Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Raditz with the University of Chicago Press. I'm filling in for my colleague Ryan today, so just bear with me. Thank you so much for joining us for the By the Book event for digital technology and democratic theory. We're pleased you can join us. Please remain muted throughout this event, but your questions are very welcome, so type them in the chat. This event is brought to you in collaboration with the Stanford PACES, the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Muwekma Ohlone, the Pawtucket, the Chumash Tongva, the Winnebago, and many other indigenous people. We recognize that the foundation of the United States rests upon the genocide, exclusion, and erasure of indigenous peoples. We give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, and learn here. All right, I'd now like to introduce you to our moderator for this event, Rob Reich. Rob is professor of political science at Stanford University, co-director of Stanford PACS, director of the Center of Ethics in Society, and associate director of the Institute of Human-Centered AI. He is one of the co-founders of Digital Technology and Democratic Theory. His teaching and writing these days focuses on ethics, policy, and technology. Thank you so much for being here today, Rob.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks to the University of Chicago Press for publishing the book, for coordinating this online webinar with the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. I'm going to serve as one of the three of the conversation today with one of the other editors, Hélène Landemore, who also was a contributor, as well as Archon Fung and Mike Ananny. I want to just spend a couple minutes sort of framing for you the conversation we'll have today that is also part of the book, and try to situate it in the moment we find ourselves in. The book has been out for about 2 months, and we hope that it speaks not only to the current moment we're in, but to a longer horizon of exploration as well. So let me begin with what probably seems obvious to everybody. We live in a moment in which the circulation and amplification of misinformation and disinformation in the online public sphere on all of the usual social media platforms, but even beyond social media platforms to ordinary digital services, is a standing concern. The deplatforming of President Trump in the days following the January 6th insurrection in the US Capitol, concerns prior to the election about misinformation and disinformation, concerns after the election about election fraud, as well as all kinds of concerns about the circulation of COVID and coronavirus vaccine misinformation and disinformation. Over the past couple years, the main social media platforms have taken much more vigorous action against misinformation and disinformation, certainly compared to the 2016 US presidential election and the lessons learned in the wake of Cambridge Analytica. But even so, the dominant spirit in ordinary discourse these days is that our current digital tools and services, which in the earliest days of their development were imagined to be tools of liberation, tools of the dissemination of democratic norms of participation, and democracy itself would thrive and be promoted through these different tools, now is seen by contrast as a mechanism for rotting the very soul of democracy itself, for the decay of democratic societies, and the purveyor of harms to individuals through hate speech and other kinds of online behavior. So when we plotted this volume now 3 years ago, the idea was to bring together scholars from across different disciplinary perspectives who often don't speak to each other. Democratic theorists are engaged in a kind of very long conversation with each other about the core norms of what makes up a healthy or flourishing democratic society. And over the course of the 20th century, it became common for democratic theorists to enter into conversation with their social science colleagues to try to learn more about the actual performance of democratic institutions, to learn more about how to think about democracy in the real world as compared to the ideals that the philosophers are commonly oriented toward. And this has led to, I think, a generation plus long interaction between democratic theorists and social scientists to the benefit of scholarship and our understanding of democracy itself. Where democratic theorists haven't been so frequently in dialogue, however, is with people in schools of engineering or beyond in related areas in which the very digital economy has been developed. And of course, folks who teach within schools of engineering and who have pioneered the development of digital technologies are themselves interested in democracy. We have a whole array of people who call themselves civic technologists, who strive to develop digital tools, services, and platforms, not just in the for-profit marketplace, but also for the benefit of public agencies and democratic institutions. But their work has been done mainly without communication with people in democratic theory or even in social science departments. So our idea 3 years ago was to bring people together across philosophy, political theory, social science, and schools of engineering, and enter into a conversation, an uncertain conversation over the course of 2 years and 3 different workshops to see whether we had some common themes that we could surface and then contribute in our own ways chapters to what became this volume. And to our surprise, and perhaps pleasant surprise, we found ourselves trying to orient a conversation both within scholarship and within the wider world to thinking about the kind of research agenda that's necessary for what we often described as a kind of mature and sober conversation about the effects of digital tools and platforms in the broader world and for democracy. The idea being that we should move beyond that kind of early techno-boosterism or techno-utopian spirit that infused so much of the early days of the development of the digital economy, but also move beyond the techno-dystopian spirit that's so common today. The idea that all there is for us to do is to clamp down on the big tech platforms that are hijacking our attention, selling off our data and violating our privacy and corroding democracies from within. We wanted instead to stage a conversation that would lift up the productive interactions between democratic theorists, social scientists, and engineers to understand something about the terrain that we live on today, and to steward a better scholarly conversation for the future, to take stock of how to steer our democratic societies in a productive rather than unproductive direction. I'll add just one more remark here as a way then of opening up the conversation to the contributors as well, which is that even if in listening to what I've just said, you still feel the pessimism of the current day, that there is too much downside attached to the way that big tech currently works and the kind of evolution and power of AI and the monopolistic tendencies of big tech and the privacy abuses that seem to be so common, I would invite you to reflect upon our experience in lockdown or in the pandemic over the course of the past year, wherever you happen to be. Whatever has continued to work somewhat well over the course of the past year, and whether it's in our work lives or in our personal lives, has likely been due to the prevalence of digital tools, services, and platforms, whether it's the very video conferencing tool we're using now for communication, whether it's the streaming services online that replaced going to the movie theaters, or whether it's the different ways you used your various devices to connect with friends and family, including those who might have been hospitalized and whom you couldn't go see personally or physically. The digital tools and services that are so ubiquitous these days, I think we have to recognize as something akin to the essential infrastructure that allows us to maintain some semblance of our patterns of interaction, both professionally and personally, which points to the fact that they're not only negative in our world and in our day. We have to find a way to take stock of these tools as infrastructure, and again, to imagine new ways of thinking about the ideals of democratic theory, the practices and design of democratic institutions that interact with the design, dissemination, and use of digital tools, platforms, and services. So with that, let me bring into conversation. We'll ask each of our contributors to speak for just a couple minutes about their particular chapter, and then we'll have a conversation amongst all of us along the way. I want to begin with Archon Fung, who contributed a chapter written with a colleague of mine, a colleague of his, Joshua Cohen, formerly a political philosopher here at Stanford, now appointed as an emeritus professor here, as well as at Apple University. Archon wrote a chapter about the digital public sphere. And if you have questions about how democratic theorists think about the transition from an analog public sphere to a digital public sphere, where it is that information circulates in a global and domestic way to help inform citizens, I recommend Archon and Josh's chapter on this. And Josh, I turn the floor over to you to say a few words about it.
Thank you so much, Rob. And thanks everyone for joining this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I'll just spend a couple minutes outlining some of the main aims and a little bit of the content of our contribution. So what we wanted to do is set out a yardstick for what counts as a good public sphere, whether it's on stone tablets or letters that people write to one another or over the radio or on social media, right? What are the general kind of characteristics? What kinds of things should we be aiming for when we build the public sphere? And we really believe that the public sphere is something that you and I, everybody in the Zoom room, everybody in the society constructs together, right? And so we think that the public sphere should enable people to do certain things. And we kind of specify what we call 5 rights and opportunities. And these are things that people should be able to do on the public sphere. And so you might think of this as the foil for this point here is a lot of the conversation about what's wrong with the public sphere. As Rob pointed out, there's a lot of conversation about misinformation and disinformation. There's a lot of conversation about hate speech. The platforms are trying to regulate this. I think from our perspective, that's a negative framing. And the idea is the implicit idea is if you got rid of misinformation and disinformation and you got rid of hate speech, things would be good on the public sphere, but that's not enough for us, right? We think that the public sphere has to do a lot more. And so what should the public sphere do? So here are 5 of the things. One is we think people should be able to get reliable information, whether it's about COVID, whether it's about the economic policies that are happening, whatever it is, people should be able to get reliable information from the public sphere. That's number 1. Number 2, people should be able to encounter a diverse array of perspectives, like all kinds of different views. Some of them you agree with, some of them you depart from, some of them will be strange and new to you. But the public sphere should be able to give you all sorts of diverse perspectives on politics, on society, on culture, on how to live your life. A third really important thing is that everyone should have an equal opportunity to express themselves on the public sphere, in the public sphere, whether their ideas are conforming or heterodox or whatever. And think here of initial expressions of Me Too or many posts and movements, or the initial social movement posts to complain about WHO and CDC guidance that said you shouldn't really wear masks because they won't really help you. And you need to reserve them all for professional healthcare workers, right? There are people who early on tweeted, say, no, I think that's exactly wrong. And we think the public sphere should allow people to express all kinds of views. And then finally, we think it's really important that the public sphere should enable people to organize and act and think collectively with one another. Here, think about the early protests in the Arab Spring, or think about the movement for Black Lives. Those are kind of what we regard as good affordances of the public sphere that enable people to act collectively. Now, that's the kind of first part. And a second part of what we say is about what we think people should do and how people should conduct themselves on the public sphere. And I think for many of us early on, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, who held relatively sanguine, some might say, critics might say, utopian views about the public sphere, we got a lot of things wrong, but maybe at its core, the thing that we got most wrong is we thought people were basically decent, and we didn't realize how awful each of us actually is when we engage in the public sphere. And so a key part of making the public sphere better is making us better as participants in the public sphere. And what does it mean to be better? One, we have three things here. We call them norms. And these are things you should take home with you and hold in your head. And every time you're thinking about tweeting or amplifying, ask yourself, am I following these three norms, right? So the first norm is regard for truth. Is you should be asking yourself before you amplify this thing, do I think it's actually true? Or does it just make me feel good to amplify it? And so we think truth seeking. Everyone should pay attention to the norm of truth on the internet. Second is a common good orientation. Is everybody should be seeking things that that they feel orient toward making all of us better. So if what you're doing on the internet is primarily rallying people around your political view or your tribe and rallying them against the other person, that's not a common good orientation, right? And we think you should dial that back a little bit. And then finally, a third norm is civility. And by that, we don't mean just being nice to people. You don't really have to be nice to everyone over the internet. That's not really a reasonable expectation. I think, although the norm of civility is that you have to explain yourself and you have to listen to other people's explanations. That kind of reciprocity is about what it means to treat someone else as an equal communicator on the internet, on social media. And we feel like that third norm is really, really important. That third norm, I think, weighs somewhat against the temptation just to unfollow or to cancel. And so because that's an act of not listening, right? So before you unfollow, before you decide to totally cancel someone, ask yourself, am I following this norm of civility? And then also, am I explaining myself rather than just yelling at someone? Why don't I leave it at there? The rest of the chapter kind of stacks up how the 20th century public sphere does according to these norms compared to the social media public sphere. And we think there's a half empty, half full story on both of those.
Great, Archon. Well, before we move over to Mike, let me just first say I forgot to introduce Archon, and he's a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard and runs the Ash Center for Democracy, Democratic Governance there as well. So extremely well positioned to comment on this. I have to get in a question for you right away, though, Archon, because I know it's going to come up for other people as well. You focused in the last couple of comments on these three norms that should help inform any individual's contributions on a platform or in the public sphere. All well and good. One other familiar piece of discourse today is that democratic societies rightly celebrate and promote a culture of freedom of expression. In the United States, of course, puts that in certain respects into the First Amendment, blocking government from censoring most forms of speech. What I'm curious to ask you is putting the onus on individuals to conduct themselves in the public sphere on the basis of these norms, it seems to be asking a lot. And I wonder if you are, in fact, also looking to inform the norms of whatever platform curation or content moderation happens to be. To make it concrete, it's a familiar idea these days that we have left an extraordinary amount of power in the hands of Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or other leaders of these social, extraordinarily large social media platforms to make decisions about deplatforming, banning various forms of speech, or the simple upranking and downranking of things in the news feeds. What kind of norms, if any, should govern how it is the companies think about this, or is that also a misplaced way of thinking about where the norms should have some bite?
No, I think it's not misplaced at all. I think that I frame them as these are things that you should do as individuals, but we really have a design perspective, and we think that the platforms should invest a lot of money and a lot of engineers in designing so that people can act and are encouraged to act on these norms, right? So, just think about the design of a park that you walk through on the way home from work, or when you used to go to work, right? It's a lot better, and everybody understands it's a lot better if the park is well lit and the hedges are trimmed back and there's lots of other people walking through the park at most times of the day. That just makes it a much more civic, a much more safe, park that is a whole set of design decisions to discourage things like assault and violence against other people, right? And we should have those norms. I shouldn't assault you in a park, but the design of the park should nudge toward that kind of good behavior as well. And so design is doing a huge amount of the work here. And we, at least I think that we have not been attentive very much at all to coming up with designs that foster and encourage people to act according to these norms.
Super. I'm sure we're going to come back to that question about value-based design in some ways, where the values are drawn in part from the spirit of democratic theory or the ideals that inform the design of democratic institutions. All right, Mike, I want to turn now to you. So Mike Ananny is a professor of communication and journalism at the USC Annenberg School. And to just introduce Mike's contribution, there's a very long-standing way of framing certain aspects of the digital economy, which has to do with the digital divide, the people who have access to the digital tools and services that we use, and the people who don't have access, whether it's because of the cost of the devices, the cost of the connection, broadband access, the cost of smartphones, et cetera, et cetera. The haves and the have-nots in the digital world. Mike's chapter acknowledges the significance of this, where there are people who participate and people who can't participate in virtue of being somehow excluded from the digital economy. But he sort of inverts the frame by saying, even for those who have access and could participate, we might want to understand silence as a form of civil disobedience in certain digital spaces, a way of protesting in certain ways or registering our dissent by not participating even if we could. I thought a really fascinating way of entering a new thought into the discussion about how it is we design and evaluate the performance of digital spaces and digital tools and services. So Mike, over to you for a few more comments about it.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rob. It was a total treat. I also want to say the process that we got to this point with you and Lucy and Hélène sort of guiding us through this interdisciplinary, multi-step process was a fantastic way of, I think, surfacing and coming at these questions and really building community kind of through the volume. So yeah, as you mentioned, I come at these questions as a communication scholar, as somebody who's trained in communication, but also as a student of science and technology studies. That's sort of the perspective I bring. As a communication scholar, it means that I'm interested in how people make meaning through media. So how people convene, how they see themselves as like or unlike each other, how they take collective action or imagine themselves as groups, beyond their individual circumstances. But the comm scholars in the world, we would center media. We would take a broad view of what media are as institutional conditions, as representational forms, cultures of technology or media production. But we consider these questions of politics and political theory are always inseparable from media, from the histories of media, from ideologies, material conditions, imaginations. It's sort of the frame that a comm scholar, I think, would bring to this space. And where I try to inflect this, or sort of take, I think, the departure that you're pointing to, is through invoking science and technology studies, which is a newer field, but one that focused on what is often called socio-technical phenomenon, which is sort of a clunky and somewhat ugly term for something that's actually, I think, quite simple and straightforward, but it's to say humans and materials come together and they cannot be separated either empirically or analytically, and that the thing we want to focus on or take seriously is this intersection of people and objects, people and materials. So in a digital context, we can think about computational algorithms, machine learning systems, social media sites, cameras, sensors, microphones, all of these things that seem like just tools. With people, all of those things do things in the world. They have action in the world. So a comm plus STS, or science technology studies perspective, is a little allergic to the idea that technology impacts society, right? Because it presumes a separation of two things. And it sort of would fail to see that technologies are societies in a way. This is a strong claim of someone like Bruno Latour, is to say that actually societies are made of technologies, humans, and people. And thinking of somebody like Norcha Maris, that societies are also technological. So it tries to sort of resist that separation and take seriously that idea that perceptions and associations and actions and consequences, all of that stuff of public life, I would say, are intersections between people and machines. So that's why I arrive at this sort of moment of saying, well, media are not channels that deliver messages. They're infrastructures that sort of structure possibilities in the way that I think you were talking about in the introduction. So in the book chapter, I try to sort of lay out this framework of what a material public is and what a socio-technical public is, and spend some time doing that. But as you mentioned, I sort of try to focus on absences or silences or blank spaces, or these things that often sort of fall through the cracks of what gets counted as, good, visible, productive participation. And I thought I'd sketch 3 places that I sort of see those absences appearing. One is in the form of individual actions. So when you think about people who take news sabbaticals, something I think a lot of people have done in the last year at different points along the way. But when people opt out of social media platforms, they do so for a host of different reasons. They do so reasons that are related to how the platforms work, who they meet, how those algorithms work. But the more that we have people who are encountering news and engaging news through platforms, when people opt out of platforms, they opt out of news. And so that absence of people from those technological spaces has real serious consequences for sort of their absence from political spaces. So that's the perspective that we bring, is like, let's pay attention to the individual actions that people would take as they sort of become closer to or further away from news spaces. The second place I think we see absences play out, I would say, is in professional cultures. So there's this recent debate in journalism about whether journalists should either attend to or ignore particular groups. And Whitney Phillips, scholar, calls this, the problem of oxygen and amplification. So should you shun the neo-Nazis and the Proud Boys and the white supremacists? Should you not pay attention to them, not give them oxygen? Or should you engage with them and say, these are people who are actually part of our political life? There's a strong debate about whether that is, but the absence of that discourse is saying something about what we think the public life looks like. And then the third bit or place I would see this absence playing out is in infrastructures, a word that you used a lot in introduction, I think quite rightly. But these absences can arise from sort of a messy mix of, where does training data come from for different machine learning algorithms? Who gets to be in a database or not? What kinds of statistical inferences guide the likelihood of something happening or not happening? There's always sort of errors that arise. AI will work for 97% of the people, 80% of the time. What about those 3% or the 20%? And sort of, can we think about that absence of space? So I'll leave it there, but I sort of share these sort of twin concerns, I guess, that I would bring to these questions of political theory. Is one is, how do people make meaning through media? And then can we reshape this idea of media as not channels, but sort of infrastructure where people and materials come together to do things in the world?
Great, thanks so much, Mike. And in the same way as I did with Archon, I got to ask you a quick question too before we turn the floor over to our colleague Hélène. To the extent that I think many people might think of various ways in which to register a silence or an absence as a kind of an active, perhaps dissent or civil disobedience, if you wanted to sort of elevate its description, it might be in the various ways you describe people taking sort of news breaks or absences from social media in order to avoid the relentlessness of it all. I also think of the campaign that various people have had, and often on social media itself, to delete Facebook and remove it from your own set of ways of interacting in the world. Without wanting you to comment necessarily on whether that's a good or bad idea, could you fit that within the way that you think about silence or absence as an act within the civic spaces that we inhabit?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. And I would so those moments, sometimes media scholars will call them like refusals or rejections. And I see those as just these incredibly rich empirical moments, because when someone leaves or quits Facebook or Twitter, some people do it just gradually and they sort of peter out. Other people do it in this sort of big blaze of drama where they're sort of like, I'm out of here and here's why I'm out of here. It's this big dramatic moment. but I see them as sort of, these are diagnostics in a way, because I ask, what exactly are people leaving? Are you leaving an algorithmic system that has consistently shown you things you don't want to see or have provoked you in some way? Are you leaving the people who are visible through those things? Are you leaving, sometimes it's an affect, are you leaving the feeling of not wanting to be a slave to this platform? So there's a whole bunch of different reasons that could be behind an absence like that. And I think all of those reasons have significance for what public life means or what sort of participation means. So I would keep an open mind about reading an absence as sort of, for me, that would be an empirical starting point to say what's behind that.
Yeah, super. All right, so I want to now introduce my co-editor and a contributor to the volume, Hélène Landemore. She's a professor in the political science department at Yale. As a way of introducing you into the conversation, Hélène, I just want to say for everyone listening that, I think within the world of the academy, there can oftentimes be an assumption that when democratic theorists or philosophers wander out from their quarters within the university to engage with other people, it's often a kind of unidirectional communication that's happening in which the philosophers deliver their well worked out norms and ideals, communicate these frameworks to their fellow colleagues on campus, and call it a day and then head back to their own territory. Hélène, in her work, in particular in her book that just came out last year called Open Democracy, is a shining example of a bi-directional conversation rather than a unidirectional conversation, in which by thinking in tandem with people who are engineers, Hélène has reimagined some of the very norms and ideals of democracy, rather than just delivering these norms and ideals to people who are building and designing tools and digital services. So, Hélène, your chapter engages with your book on open democracy, and it's far from a pessimistic view. It's in fact a kind of vision of what could be with respect to democratic institutions if only we could design various tools and services to enhance how we think of democracy's actual operation. So, would love to hear from you about the contribution to the chapter.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you also for including me in this editorial project. I want to echo what Mike and Ananny just said. It was really interesting, sometimes difficult conversation. I remember the first time we all met. I mean, there were a lot of talking past each other because we came from such different disciplines, but I felt like over the course of the 3 meetings, we really converged and progressed and co-constructed, this volume, and I think it's a beautiful thing. So my chapter is indeed perhaps too optimistic, but it was an excuse to imagine how digital technologies could enable at various scales, potentially a global scale, a new form of democracy that I call open democracy, and that's meant to be an alternative to our existing so-called representative democracies. Because I often feel that we see technologies as a way to just digitize our existing systems and make them better, more efficient in some ways, but in the end, we're not really questioning the institutional principles behind them, whether it's periodic elections or this dichotomy between the sort of role of representatives and the role of citizens that is usually conceived along much more passive lines as just voting every 4 years. And my idea was to envision a sort of science fictional future in which we would all be able to access the power of the decision-making power, whether because we are enrolled in autocratic bodies that are randomly allotted, or because we can participate in online platforms where our opinions are aggregated and we get to exchange with other people again, in numbers and at scale that seemed science fictional just a few years ago. And so that's why I start the chapter with this little vignette about the year 2025, when this woman, this 20-year-old woman in Greece, Angeliki Papadopoulos, I imagine I was harking back to the ancient Greece there with this choice of a character, is selected to, she receives an email that tells her she's selected to be a part of the House of the people in Europe. So she's going to be sent for 3 years to Brussels to help set the agenda and make laws for the entire, European Union. She's going to be in this group of 499 people, and she's going to change her life. She's going to have access to resources, and she's going to make connections and learn about the world in ways that she, who's a bed and breakfast manager, would not have been able to dream otherwise. So technologies here play a role of enabling this new system, and in particular 2 principles that I see as central to it, which are deliberation and democratic representation, by which I mean a more equal form of representation than electoral representation allows for. When it comes to deliberation, the ideal ultimately for me is some sort of world in which all our brains are connected seamlessly, and we sort of are able to transfer and process information instantly and get to the best possible decisions for the entire species, or at the very least the entire community we're a part of. And I think digital technologies, but also artificial intelligence, of course, which we don't talk about perhaps as much, but is definitely key, might permit one day to have this sort of mass deliberation that we can only conduct at a small scale for now. In fact, if you think about it, representative government, the ancestor to representative democracy, was born in the 18th century under very different technological and epistemological constraints. And so it's normal that at the time we thought, well, it's better to delegate the task of making decisions and deliberating about them to a small group of very smart people, preferably socioeconomic elites who have the time and education to make enlightened decisions. But now we are under very, very different, we're operating under very different circumstances. And so maybe it's time to be bolder. And I'm a little frustrated with the pessimism of a lot of the science fiction that I read. I love science fiction, but if you read Red Mars, it's all about how we're bringing all the flaws of our existing systems to Mars. And it's actually, potentially worse. I mean, so if we continue not lacking in imagination, I'm afraid we're going to marshal technology for the wrong end. And so I was trying to push for at least a different vision. So I'll stop here.
Super. But, I know enough about some of your work, Hélène, that even though you describe it here as a little bit of science fiction and enlarging our imagination for what kind of democratic institutions we can have, part of what you write about,
that's true. Yes,
that some of these things have existed. I want to call attention in particular. I had the good fortune just earlier this week to have a conversation for a class I'm teaching at Stanford with Audrey Tang, the minister in Taiwan. I know that you've interacted with her as well. She describes herself as a kind of minister without portfolio, a civic hacker who's done all types of extraordinary things in Taiwan, partly related to their success in combating COVID, but far beyond that as well. And in the conversation I just had with her, she said, part of the problem with ordinary forms of democracy, using these technology metaphors, she said, is that the bit rate for civic participation is so low. Like, we need to up the bit rate for ordinary citizens to participate in their own collective self-governance. So maybe you can say a little bit about what happens in Taiwan or anything else. But
thank you for saying that, because actually you're right that part of what I do is actually not that science fictional or even imaginative. I borrow a lot from what's being done already, and in fact, as you said, some of the principles I theorize, I'm not making them up as much as inducing them from experiments I've observed around the world, whether it's in Iceland with its crowdsourcing crowdsourced constitutional process, or France just now that had this citizens assembly on climate change. Wasn't very technological, though the pandemic forced them to move on Zoom like everyone else, but you could imagine a sort of a really digitally technologically augmented version of that would be even more impressive. And then Taiwan, I mean, what Audrey Tang is doing in Taiwan is absolutely remarkable, and I regret not talking about it more actually in my chapter, but I only got to really understand what she's up to recently, as you mentioned. So it's not as deliberative as I would like, but it's about software and platforms and use of basic AI that tracks existing consensus in the population around very difficult questions like the how to manage the insertion of Airbnb or Uber in the socio-economic ecology of Taiwan. And they managed to really create interaction between different stakeholders and an exchange of views online in a perfectly, sort of civil way. And that resulted in recommendation that when they were then processed by the elected system and that solved the issues. And the same thing on the pandemic. They're probably one of the only, if not the only country that managed to solve the issue without a confinement. And they're doing great, and they're going to the movies, and they've solved the issue by fighting rumors very efficiently, using humor over rumor, as they say, involving citizens in all kinds of ways to report on mask supplies and identifying where they were missing. They have a completely disinhibited relationship to the use of technology and data, and they trust the government not to use that data against them, in part because Audrey Tong is such a fantastic leader. But I think there's a lot to emulate there.
Yeah, super. All right, let me open it up to collective conversation. I'm worried we might have lost Mike Ananny, and maybe he'll rejoin, or if Kristen finds him in the waiting room, we'll certainly get him right back into conversation. But for Hélène and Archon, I want to ask the general question, which has come up already in a bunch of the questions that the audience has posed, which is, in the vast majority of democratic societies, the political economy that exists for producing technological innovation means that it's overwhelmingly taking place within the private marketplace, harnessed in general to the incentive structure of profit making. Whether it's because the norms, for example, Archon, that you've described, should help inform the design of these infrastructures, these digital infrastructures, for civic or democratic purposes, or as Hélène, you're imagining that we can, Audrey Tang style, imagine that there are a variety of different ways of thinking about the digital infrastructures that are designed for civic and political participation. How do we get that from within the private marketplace and the incentive structure of the political economy there, which is in general not directing our talent on the technological frontier to think first and foremost about democratic norms or the design of civic and democratic infrastructures? Hélène, do you want to start with that?
Sure, maybe I'm culturally biased here, but I don't think the private sector can provide what's essentially a public good. So I just don't see how you make that happen. What you observe in Taiwan, it's led by a minister who's, incentivizing people and creating a community where people do this not for profit, but because it's the right thing to do, and because there are people, the government is using taxes to provide for some of these infrastructures. So I just don't see it emerging from the private sector. It needs to be a tax-funded public project of sorts. That's why, maybe I'm lacking in imagination, but in my little opening vignette, I imagine that people in my future open democracy operate on a platform called Citizen Book, which is a non-profit version of Facebook. Facebook is not by itself going to turn into a democratic platform. There's no way. So
yeah. All right, so Hélène, but let's make this concrete if we can in a way. So when imagine you're teaching 300 computer science students at Yale, and is what you're doing trying to fill their heads with the aspiration of Citizen Book, even as the tech companies come and recruit them on campus, and it's a kind of civic exhortation to them to do the democratic thing.
Yes. So that's, for you, that's the private sector part in supporting that view. Oh yes, okay, that part I agree. That's true. Norms and exhortations can be quite consequential and significant. Oh, absolutely, but somebody needs to pay my salary. If you count on if I needed to make money out of these ideas, I'd be in trouble. That's what I'm saying, and it's going to be the same for companies that they as long as they depend on a business model where.
Yep. All right, so Archon, Hélène wants to redirect the talent flow into civic and democratic digital infrastructure. Is that your preferred solution?
I like money. I think it's okay if Google and Facebook like money too.
Me too.
I think they could get by with less of it. I think that it is possible to change the business model. I think historically, a couple of factors that have really helped out are fear and power. And so let me elaborate for a moment. So we talk a little bit about this in our chapter. One important moment of technological change was the pre-World War II period in which radio and film got big. And a lot of people thought that those technologies assisted the rise of fascism in Japan and Germany and Italy. And after World War II, the democratic societies, Britain, Europe, the United States, were very concerned with reorganizing these mass media technologies to be friendly for democracy rather than toxic to it. And a bunch of stuff happened. And many of these, the large media companies internalized a sense of corporate social responsibility for democracy. And that was costly. A couple of costs. One, they had to pay journalists enough to create a profession. That costs a lot more money than not doing that. And they had to internalize certain norms, such as the separation of the business part from the reporting part. Those norms were frequently violated, to be sure, but they were norms. And so the norm was, I think everybody understood, look, if your reporter writes a story that happens to be true, that exposes bad activities of your largest advertiser, you've kind of got to take it on the chin and run that story, right? Because why? Because it's good for democracy, because truth is good for democracy. So so I think that the media owners, the corporations, were motivated by two kinds of fear. One is fear of fascism. Two is fear of socialism. They didn't want to see the BBC or the CBC becoming, they didn't want to be socialized. So both of those kinds of fears were doing work that generated a fair amount of power and pressure on them to change, to internalize democracy, reinforcing policies and behaviors. And so I do really, really think that we need some analogous mechanism now to take advantage of the palpable fear to generate political power to change the internal operations, so that these companies, they would make a little less money. It's true. They would make a little less money. They'd have to pay a little bit more for fact generation. They'd have to pay a little bit more not to stick their arms down your limbic system like Tristan Harris complains about. They'd make a little less money, but I think they'd still make plenty of money, and things for democracy would be a lot better.
Hélène, I worry I might have misrepresented what you said before. Did you want to correct something or just add to the conversation?
No, but I'm not sure I disagree with Archon, but when he says fear, it's fear of socialism, fear of government. So, it's also the reality that it's a public good needs to be partly produced directly or indirectly by the presence of a strong government that has the common good in its sight. And I'm thinking again of the time of Audrey Tang. She's the one who generated this. She worked with the civil community to create this Taiwan fact check entity that basically makes sure that as soon as there's a rumor, a fake news, it's disproven not by government so much as the civil community with the support of or encouragement, or I'm not exactly sure how they do it over there. So it's really interesting to watch it works. But
just on that
to me is a good solution, but it's going to come from an incentive in people in the civil community that's not money. Money cannot fix this.
Yeah. Just on that one point about Audrey Tang, Taiwan, and how they combat misinformation or disinformation, viral misinformation, disinformation, the humor over rumor, the insight that by having counter speech that is satirical or somehow mocks the initial viral misinformation or disinformation, they found some success in depressing the virality and directing attention over to the humorous. And so I was shocked to hear the answer to this. I said, are you telling me that Taiwan employs comedians that pumps out counter speech into the digital public sphere? And her answer was, yes, many of them, and we pay them very well.
So I didn't know that, but I know they use, cute memes. As she says,
right.
If it's not viral, is that you didn't use enough cute puppies or something like that. I mean,
Right, exactly. Yeah. All right, we got a great question here. I want to get into the conversation. Person asks, how can we reconcile the tension between, number one, technology being an enabler of new innovative democratic systems such as liquid democracy, deliberative democracy, or indeed the open democracy Professor Landemore conceptualizes, all of which seem to be a promising way to improve citizen representation. And two, technology, and in particular data sets that potentially reproduce power relations and categories, that is to represent people and their experiences according to hegemonic epistemologies or the reinforcement of the current power structures in society. How do we get in between that dynamic in which the ways we categorize and represent people in data sets is reproducing power relationships in the real world? Hélène, you want to start?
Really hard question. My instinct is to think in terms of decentralizing power and reconfiguring power where these technologies are produced, meaning in corporations. If you give a lot more power to the engineers themselves, to the user community, if you organized a lot more consultation and feedback loops between at least those two constituencies, the engineers and the users, I think you would fix some of the issues. The top-down, vertical, very oligarchic structures of corporations, I think, are in themselves generating a lot of issues.
Mm-hmm.
If from the top you're told, your engineers are told, maximize the length of time spent on this app, you're not going to get the same result as if you're setting a different expectation or goal. So I would start there. But I don't know how you make that happen.
I don't know. I guess I'd like to understand a little bit more about how closed and hegemonic this process really is, right? When the MIT studies reveal racial bias and facial recognition, when somebody points out that the bail algorithms or the recidivism algorithms have racial discriminatory concepts, that one turns out to be hard because there's kind of an impossibility thing going on there. But when critics point these out, at least some of the ones that come to the top of my head, people get new data sets, they try to rework the algorithms to account for these criticisms. So it feels like, at least for some sector of these activities, there's a relative openness to the biases and the hierarchical reinforcement being criticized, and then some engineering data policy response. Maybe there's a whole set of areas that I'm not thinking about that are really kind of closed and hegemonic and really where the hierarchy is very difficult to penetrate. But the ones that come to my mind feel a little bit more plastic in response.
Yeah. Good. All right, I want to get one more question into conversation here. This one asks, how can we place the need for veracity of information within diversity and perspective in the digital public sphere? And let me add to it just by saying, I think we can also understand this as, Timothy Gartnash, a colleague of mine at Stanford and who teaches at Oxford, has this lovely line that the huge social media companies privilege virality over veracity. So, Archon, you said something about the norm of truth seeking within the digital public sphere. Hélène, you've been talking about the incentive structures of the for-profit companies for engagement and time on platform. The thing I want to add to the how to lift up the norm of veracity within the digital public sphere, or the challenge, is that I don't exactly know what the figures are these days, but something like 1 billion pieces of content posted every day on Facebook, millions of new hours of video every day on YouTube. So the volume of content is so enormous that there have to be, at a minimum, some automated tools that help up rank, down rank, sort, categorize. There's no possibility of human review given the flow of information, a human review alone. So how do we up-rank veracity and down-rank for virality while maintaining diversity of perspective? Go ahead, Hélène.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go first, Archon. Actually, I need to think more.
So one thing Josh really impressed on me in the course of this chapter, which really kind of reflects loudly, or I hope clearly, is that it's hard to get to the truth, even if you're really trying to, right? And so, I mean, we see that all the time. And so I think one kind of temptation in this debate is that there's some independent and reliable arbiter of the truth that we could go to, and then we could just flag everything else as misinformation or untruth. And I guess I just don't think it works that way. I mean, think about, as I said, the initial guidance from the CDC and the WHO on masks, or think about, if you try to assert in the run up to the Gulf War that Saddam Hussein really didn't have weapons of mass destruction, right? Those are things that happen to be true, right? Whereas the common arbiters of truth tell you that they're wrong, because guess what? Getting to the truth, even when you're really trying, can be very, very difficult. And so what the public sphere, you got to have diversity that hopefully has the shreds of truth in it. And then you've got to have what I think we need much more of now is a bunch of people, a bunch of actors interacting on the public sphere, actually trying to find that truth, right? And that's kind of, some people have said that's what a functioning scientific community is, right? There's lots of diversity in there, but the players in it are less truth.
Yep. Hélène?
Yeah, so I'm taken with this idea that I saw a sort of innovator, develop. Federico asked. He has this idea of crowd juries, which are basically, Athenian juries, but just digitized online. People that are brought together to settle issues of facts, and they have access to all the data that's relevant through a system of based on blockchain that make it very safe. And you multiply those, maybe you pay people like mTurk. It's a source of income for people all over the world, and you're sure to get a really diverse sample. Could be very large. I don't know what would be the ideal size really, but and that would certainly be a departure from our reliance on expert committees and scientific committees and editorial boards, or even this oversight board that now Facebook has conjured out of thin air, as far as I'm concerned. Like, we don't know who these people are. They're chosen by Facebook. What legitimacy do they have? Like, it's a copy. I mean, it's an imitation of a Supreme Court without any of the sort of like safety and accountability mechanisms we kind of have in an electoral democracy. So I'd be happier with a crowd jury than with this Facebook oversight board, for example. Mm-hmm. So on whether or not to post or not post certain things. And if we multiplied them, then you decentralize. I think there are some accountability in numbers, actually.
Super. I want to close out in just a minute. I see that Mike and Ananny has just rejoined us by phone. Mike, I don't know when you rejoined or if you want to get in on the conversation.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to talk about. Guys. Yeah, exactly. My performative of my chapter. No, I was able to hear the last couple minutes and would echo it. And maybe the one final thing I would try to add to this is that for researchers and scholars on this, I would love us to be able to have more access into the technology companies where a lot of these decisions are made. So they're not only in data sets, they're not only in sort of machine learning algorithms that are doing this, but they're also in the cultures that are deciding which problems to work on, or how much scale to desire, or what kinds of errors to tolerate or not, or how fast to move on different solutions. And I think there's really an opportunity that we urgently need to understand more about how private companies make these decisions.
Thanks, Mike. All right, I'm going to turn the floor over back to Kristen, but before I do, I'll just make a gesture at a concluding or synthetic remark of my own here, which is that part of the spirit of this volume that we put together, Digital Technology and Democratic Theory, was again this interdisciplinary conversation. And something that came to the fore for me, both in the workshops that we had these discussions that produced the volume, in the conversation today with Archon, Hélène, and Mike, is that it's a familiar way to think from the standpoint of democratic theory that democracy itself and democratic institutions are a form of social problem solving through collective activity, and an experimentalist form of social problem solving, because we can always update what we learn, try again with a set of new representatives or new institutional designs. It's historically quite a successful form of social problem solving. Casting democratic theory with that type of language resonates for the most part with people who are technologists, because they see themselves as problem solvers as well, often taking experimental, iterative approaches to updating their own views through their own solutions. And I think there's a productive way of marrying the two perspectives so that, as Hélène has imagined in her own work in open democracy, as Archon and his colleague Josh have imagined in their work in thinking about the norms of the digital public sphere, and as Mike and the rest of the folks in the volume have imagined in various ways as well, this experimentalist approach to social problem solving fits easily within the tradition of democratic theory and democratic ideals. And there is so much new territory to be explored through the conjunction of philosophers, social scientists, and engineers. So with that, let me turn the floor back over to Kristen to thank you and the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society for hosting this event. And Kristen, I'll give you the last word.
Oh, what a wonderful event. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for such a great conversation, and to everyone who attended for your comments and questions. This has really been wonderful. I dropped the link for the book information, purchase link, in the chat, and the discount code. There were a couple of requests for an ebook discount code, so I've left that as well. It's DTAN-DDT2. You'll see it there. But yeah, thank you so much. This has been wonderful, and the archive of the event will be up on our YouTube page in about a week or two. So you can always check it out there, share it with people. Yeah, thank you so much. And I will close this out now. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you.